The question is that you're reading into halakha, into Judaism, rather than letting Judaism speak to you. That's a classic challenge that people have when they're dealing with Torah policy on this level. The idea of someone saying, well, it's important, let's say, the issue of secular studies. Oh, you want this, therefore you're trying to read it into Judaism rather than actually allowing Judaism to speak to you. And the point is that since there's a reality that you are involved in even determining what Torah is about, it's a very strange psycho challenge. You're reading too much into Torah, but on the other hand, you have to read into Torah. The Torah demands you to think. The Torah demands you to question. The Torah demands you to analyze and to investigate and to bring your own self into that analysis. So how do you determine whether your analysis is a truly acceptable Torah analysis, or whether it is something that is really open to challenge and questioning? This gets into issues of women in Judaism these days, gets into issues of secular studies, gets into issues of Eretz Yisrael, and this is always a challenge. People take positions, and the challenge against these positions is you're not really seeing what the Torah wants, you're reading it into the Torah. So how do you know that it really is a true Torah position, and how do you understand when you're investigating the Gestalt of policy that you're actually on the road to finding a Torah policy or whether you're reading into it? Fact is that is exactly that issue. Exactly is the issue, for example, between the early conservative Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. The early conservative rabbis were very much halachic. I mean, the early conservative rabbis, if they existed today, you would think they were Orthodox. I mean, there were, it was Zachariah Frankel, who was the founder, or I think the founder of the Breslau Seminary in Germany. There's a whole controversy around him and so forth and so forth. I spoke about this, but the fact is that we have pictures of him, and he looks like a Hasidic guy. Okay, and the fact is that it's very hard to really point out, oh, this is his point of apikoros. He did a lot of the scholarly analysis and so forth, but what really was it that led to his conclusions not being accepted within normative orthodoxy? Although there was whole issues about this. They tried. There's a statement from Azriel Hildesheimer where he attacks a Frankel. He says the person is just a min, and apikoros, and so a Frankel. So someone tried to say this was Azriel Hildesheimer's view of Zachariah Frankel. Azriel Hildesheimer was the founder of the Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin, which is basically the Berlin Yeshiva, and it had three great Rosh Yeshivas: Azriel Hildesheimer, and then David Tzvi Hafid, who was known by the Lamed Hoyle, and then Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, known as the Sridei Eish. So this was a really powerful yeshiva, so he was a major figure in German Orthodoxy in the 1800s and so forth. And therefore he was quoted as attacking Zachariah Frankel, which really shows he was out, that this is where you draw the pale and so forth. But then there was an article I was reading that said that there seems to be other points where Azriel Hildesheimer spoke about Zachariah Frankel with tremendous kavod, and spoke to him as a Talmid Chacham and so forth. And they said, so what's going on here? And then they found out that the Frankel this article that Azriel Hildesheimer sort of attacked was really a Meshumad, a Jewish Christian. So that was it. But he really seemed to hold his Zachariah Frankel. There's an interesting article just read that there was a Rav in New York who was an actual product of the Breslau Seminary. He was accepted by the Orthodox world, and obviously we're talking in the early world of the 20th century, and he maintained that the Breslau Seminary was Orthodox. Okay, so the point is how do you draw the line? How do you draw the line? So, or what has become the acceptable way of drawing the line? Yeah.
Brings a couple things to mind. One is, I find the notion of kind of understand, let's say, some of the Chumash. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there are times when there are some notions of a plain shot, whatever it is, that's what it says, that's what it means. There are other times it says things which it doesn't mean that. So how people can have some confidence of what something means is a major mystery to me. There's that aspect. There's also something, I forget really the context, but I'll tell you what I remember about it. It could have been because it was a medrash or something else. There was something that didn't seem to be factually true. But since it was trying maybe to make a point or something like that, like my son sort of accepted it. It was okay, because while something was not, I would agree, was not factually correct, but if it was to illustrate a point, that was okay. So I have found that as being very, from an intellectual standpoint, exceedingly disturbing.
It's all part of the methodology. The fact is that certain statements are taken as factual, certain statements are taken as not factual. The question, and this is really what it comes down to, is its place within the whole corpus. You know, the idea of seeing the parts as part of the whole corpus of the system gives you certain workings of it. So, for example, when you have certain statements made by Gedolim that seem very powerful, it's because they just can't accept or seem like revolutionary. They just can't accept the simple pshat as stands because of the whole corpus of Torah. Their complete knowledge of Torah yields them to conclude that this statement is a problem when taken into, if taken literally, it would be a problem taken into the whole corpus of the system. And really what you're getting at is one of the factors that's involved in Torah policy. Torah policy really believes it's a unified system. Perhaps the first starting point. That you believe the entire Torah comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the one God, and therefore,
what is the entire Torah, this definition?
All the things that became information. In other words, all the information that came and all the information that was developed that was accepted as part of the corpus. So when you look at all the material, you see a Rambam, you see a Ramban, you see this has all been information that has been accepted as part of the corpus of Torah, and you perceive it as a unified unit. It's somewhat challenging because there's disagreements and so forth, but there's a Gemara that states that it's very important to recognize that Torah is from Roa Echad. It's from one what do you call it? One shepherd. Okay, it all comes from one place. Therefore, there's a real attempt within the perception of Torah of trying to work with it as a concrete unit, as a complete unit. That means a lot of disagreements and so forth, but there's a real attempt to see it as one entity. Let me take that a little bit further of what I mean by this. If you speak in terms of the historical school, which is the basis of conservative Judaism, and the reason I'm focusing on conservative Judaism is because Reform Judaism, you understand why it's outside of Torah. They say it's okay to eat pork, so obviously it's completely non-halachic. The real challenge of understanding things is when you see things that seem to fit into halacha, and yet there's challenges that maybe it's outside of halacha. You have those challenges today with some aspects of women's rights in the world and so forth. And the point is how do you draw the line of saying that this is acceptable within Orthodoxy, not acceptable within Orthodoxy, which is a real challenge. But the point is how do you come up with an idea of what makes your analysis something that will be acceptable within the system. What the historical school did in terms of conservative Judaism, it basically said that things changed because of history and allowed for changes to happen. So for the example of what we're saying, they would say, hey, the Rambam, and this would not be the way you'd want to say it, the Rambam had his attitudes towards women because that's the way the world looked at women those days, in those days. Okay? Okay? Now the Rambam wouldn't necessarily have those same attitudes. Okay? And therefore we're not bound to those attitudes. In other words, history is allowed to play much more of a force. Things change, and because things change, you can reread. You can read and say, oh, they read it this way back then because they had this attitude. Now we're going to read it differently because we have our attitude today. Now, that is not always necessarily wrong, that attitude. Okay? In other words, things do change. Okay? And like, the situations, for example, halacha, you have Ramosha say, Nishtana Habriot, that the world has changed, and therefore it has a different aspect in terms of halacha. You have a lot of cases in halacha where you have a psak in the 1500s because of a certain situation, and now it's a different situation, so it's a different psak. Okay, like for example, the Gemara says that on Yontif, you can't take a bath on Yontif, you can't take a shower on Yontif, right? Even though it's for Sarach Chol Nefesh, things are permitted if it's necessary on Yontif. When we say Sarach Chol Nefesh, that means specifically for food, but what it means is for a necessity. You're allowed to do things on Yontif, melachas on Yontif, if it's a necessity. But the Gemara says not things like showers, because there are certain rules of it has to be a necessity. It has to be that people do this on a common basis every day, so forth and so forth. Something you can do the day before, you can't do it that day. Like for example, shchita. The reason they say shchita is mutter on Yantiv is because shchita, because you want the animal to be fresh. If you shech them erev Yantiv, if it would have been okay, then you should shech the erev Yantiv. But if you want the meat fresh, which in those days without refrigeration, then you have to shech it on Yantiv. So the question was, you can't take showers according to the straight shot, according to what it seems there. There's a lot of Rabbanim who say that doesn't apply anymore. Why? Because the attitude towards showers have changed. People now shower daily. So the fact they shower erev Yantiv doesn't change the reality that they would shower the next day also. And that's for tzorach. People feel more of a need to shower and so forth. Therefore, there are a lot of Rabbanim who say it's okay now to shower on Yontif. Okay?
Or perhaps, maybe they say if you needed warm water, you had to do certain sorts of work with fire and so forth.
Yeah, but that was okay on Yontif. That would be okay. You can heat water for cooking on Yontif.
Well, so but why not say
theoretically.
But let's say for Shabbos.
Oh, this is something different. We're talking Yontif.
No, I appreciate that, but I'm just suggesting that certain things that may not have been seemingly doable or proper because of ancillary things. Right,
so people say this. You see, you have this similar type of argument where the person says, "Well, it used to be really hard to get fire. That's why it was real hard work to light a fire back in those days. That's why it was a prohibition of Shabbos. Now it's not real hard work, therefore it should be okay." That's not a halachic argument. You see, this is exactly the point. Okay, because what happens in Orthodoxy is that any argument that you give, when you present the argument, you have to feel that this is an argument that you could present in the eternal base medrash. In other words, if the Rambam would say something about women in the 1200s, and you want to disagree with that, you have to perceive it that you can make this argument before the Rambam, and he would possibly accept it. Because what happens within Orthodoxy, and this is the challenge of the historical school, you do accept that facts change, even within Orthodoxy. There's no doubt that there's facts that change. But the thing that doesn't change is the system and the underlying thought processes. And what happens is within Orthodoxy, as a fundamental principle, it's almost that any time you talk in these theories, there's something in the Orthodox mind that feels that he could present this argument in any time, in any place. In other words, if I say the Rambam held this way because of women in the 1200s, okay, because there's a reality of what he understood to be the social reality of women in the 1200s. And I'm sitting there and saying the halacha now for women is you can teach them more Torah and so forth, because they are in a different social situation than they were in the 1200s. Okay, that means the facts have changed. That's all you're saying, the facts have changed. Oh, so how do you understand the Rambam's learning of the Torah? The Rambam doesn't say, the Rambam learns it out, Psukim, and says this is from Nashim, and you have Psukim, so on and so forth. You have to be able to say, this is how I would argue with the Rambam in an eternal Beis Medrash. I would end up saying that in his analysis of the actual halachic mechanisms, this is the idea, and so forth and so forth. And therefore, I would give this argument in the same type of perception. In other words, in the historical school, the conservative historical school, there's a perception that ideas change, and the way we think changes. And there's not the perception when I come up with an idea today. Like, for example, give me an example. The present conservative argument concerning homosexuality, the allowance for homosexuality and the way they understand the verse and so forth. They're saying things have changed and so forth, and therefore we can understand the verse this way, understand it that way, and so forth, and that's the historical world and so forth and so forth. But the problem is that argument, could you state that argument to the Rambam? Could you state that argument to Rashi? Could you be willing to argue it within the corpus of thought of halacha? And the fact is what they're saying is, what they would say is, well, no, because history has changed things. They thought one way, we think differently. In the Orthodox world, you basically have to believe that you can argue this way in the Beis Medrash with everyone there. There's a classic statement from Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik. As Siyam, he talks about what it's like to learn a Choshen Mishpat, a story, learning of commercial law. And he states that you feel that, first of all, the Rambam is there, and Rashi is there. And if you're learning Choshen Mishpat, you feel that the Ksos is there, one of the major Achronim, and you feel like you're in the room with all of them. The fact is that in a certain way, Torah takes on an eternal perspective, and you feel you're in the room with all of them. So when I offer ideas, I basically have to say, listen, I think I can make this argument in front of anyone. So for example, the difference in terms of what I just said about showers, I can sit there and say, listen, I think the argument of the poskim who permit showers, it's not history has changed. It's that the situation has changed. But the argument I would give for this situation, if the Chachmei Gemara had the same information, they would give the same answer. They would give the exact same answer. That has to be my belief. In Orthodoxy, we believe that given the change of circumstances. So what people would say is that given our understanding of showering today, I would argue that even the posek who said you can't do this back, and even in the Gemara, would say now it's okay because the facts have changed. But I believe he's in the same mindset as me in terms of learning, in terms of analysis. In the historical model, that's not, they really think that history changes the thought processes and people think differently. But the fact is that in halacha, you don't think things can change that way in terms of the analysis of halacha. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. Take slavery, okay? I don't know anyone who feels comfortable about slavery today, right? The idea of actually owning a human being and telling him what to do and the extreme of slavery in terms of taking selling a kid away from his parents and so forth and so forth. I think that generally everyone today would have this attitude that's against slavery. But obviously, in the South, before the before the Civil War, right? People thought they were good people, and they thought it was okay to have slaves and to sell slaves. Okay, their morals didn't change and so forth. So we would say there's historical progression. That's what they see. Sort of, they're against slavery. Now it's for slavery. Now the truth is you have that within Torah. Well, the fact is that there's certain concepts, like for example, Eliezer Berkowitz argues this way in terms of what he calls Torah tolerated. He has ideas that there's certain Torah concepts that have developed over time. One is slavery. He felt that the aspect of a halachic definition of slavery in the time of the Sinus Torah, by the time, given the fact of how Torah would influence people in terms of slavery, then people would now come down and not be pro-slavery. So there's movement and change of individuals. But the question exists, what about the halachic process itself? So the idea within Orthodoxy is, in terms of the actual halachic process, that's eternal. And therefore, when you're talking halacha, whether you would believe that if you had a pshat about slavery today in halachic analysis, not due to the changes that are extra halachic, whatever, but just if you felt that you had a halachic analysis that came down to a certain conclusion, you feel that you believe you could make that argument in front of the Rambam, in front of Rabbi Akiva. That's what happens in Orthodoxy. The present rabbis in Orthodoxy, in certain ways, let's say, who are trying to be radical in terms of let's say certain aspects of women's participation in tefillah. The distinction is some people say, well, now it's different, and we don't have to. We can do things a little bit differently, and we sort of find a way to read it differently. But in terms of true analysis of an Orthodox perspective, a person who really believes this would say, and I can make this argument in front of any one of the Rishonim, any one of the Tanaim. Misforas ha'halacha, misforas ha'torah, the person would have to accept my svara. I can make that argument. So, and that's really a big difference. In other words, this is one of the issues that exists in terms of one of the aspects of policy, is whether you feel that your analysis is telling you what you really believe the Torah truth is, or whether it is you finding a way to maintain your way in Torah. That's a real issue in terms of let's say women in Judaism. Okay, like for example, there's a whole argument nowadays about women leading Kabbalat Shabbat, right? Kabbalat Shabbat. And there's an attempt to try and have women lead Kabbalat Shabbat in certain places in the world. And the argument is that why not? Why not? Kabbalat Shabbat isn't Davar Shebekdusha, it doesn't need a minyan. Is there any reason for women not to be able to lead Kabbalat Shabbat? Almost everyone agrees you can't really say it's prohibited. Really can't. There's no reason to say it's prohibited. The question is it something should you do or should you not do? So there's people who are saying, hey, it's not prohibited, so therefore why not do it? Okay, that's an argument, that's it. There's other people who are saying, wait a second, that's not the issue. The issue is should I be doing it? Is that something I should be involved with or not? What is the overall perspective of Torah on this? And I know one of my daughters said to me that her whole difficulty with the issue is she wants to hear what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling her about what it means to be a Jewish woman. She's not trying to find ways that she can map out within the system of how can she do what she wants and still call herself halachic. She wants to hear what the system is telling her. Now, obviously, in terms of what it's telling her, it's going to have some aspect of her own natiyas and her own viewpoints and so forth and so forth. But she wants to hear, what is God saying? And the way that we really determine that at a certain level is in an idea that if you look at the eternal base medrash, could your argument stand in the base medrash? With all the Rishonim Acharonim, all the Tanaim Amoraim, could you give an argument that basically says, this is my pshat in Torah. Not this is my way of reading into Torah. Not this is my way of finding the some way of doing what I want in Torah. Is this what I really believe is the Torah is telling me? And could I argue it in front of anyone? And that, I think, is a powerful concept within Orthodoxy. That the true Orthodox individual, you look at the great names in Orthodoxy, I think Rav Kook, let's say more the ones who came up with new ideas, Rav Kook, Shem Shofar Hirsch, the ones who are a little bit more innovative, the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik, they honestly would tell you this is what they believe is what Torah wants, and their arguments could stand in front of the Rambam or Rashi, and they could argue it just from the logic of the analysis. And that's a tremendous statement. Not simply, listen, I can find a way of reading it into the system. I find a way of doing it and saying that things change because of history. There is change of facts because of history, but I have to believe that my final conclusion can withstand the challenge of anyone. So if I'm going to say it's okay to learn Torah or learn Gemara with women, when Rabbi Soloveitchik came out and said it's okay to teach women Gemara, right? I'm sure in his mind, given the facts, he believes that he could present the argument in front of the Rambam, who actually says you shouldn't teach women Gemara. He says no. He could give an argument of how to understand it that the Rambam would say, that right in front of the Rambam, and not dismiss it to historical change. Yeah.
Maybe accused of being a bit of an anti-semantic here.
Mm-hmm.
I say, can you make the argument? One can make an argument, may not be successful.
Right.
Now, I don't know whether Rabbi Soloveitchik putting his argument in front of the eternal base of men would necessarily win them over.
That's something different.
Well, okay, but it seems to me something that's rather losing. Can I make the argument?
Being able to make the argument is not saying I'm gonna be victorious in my argument.
Understand.
A lot of people made arguments and were said, Tanaim disagree with Tanaim, Amraim disagree with Amraim. Okay. But there's a fact where there's a point where one thing is first of all the argument is logical. Right, you do see in the Gemara that they do challenge things as tiyuftas. The tiyufta is something where we've proven that it's not logically defendable.
Who defines what's logical?
Well, through logic. If you follow this conclusion, your analysis is based on, would yield that 1 + 1 = 3. But 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3, therefore your argument doesn't work. Okay, that's usually what the Gemara does when it says tiyufta. It leads down to a position where there's an inherent inconsistency and a logical possibility of it. Okay, but what happens is that when you're able to withstand the argument, say you're making the argument, the difference is you're not saying that the Rambam's attitude and halachic perception was colored by his history, right? You're not saying, well, that's the history of the time, and that's his perception of Judaism, and now it's a new history and there's a new perception. What he's saying is, okay, listen, if you want to define that women changed over the last 800 years in certain ways, which they did go through social changes, that's an acceptable change. But then you're going to say, listen, when the Rambam gave this psak, it was with this understanding of women because based upon the information he had at the time. But even the Rambam would agree that given the knowledge of women today, Torah, from the argument of Torah, he also would say you can teach women Gemara today. That would be something where I think that people who want to argue it's okay to teach Gemara today, is the difference is that what they're saying is, now we're going to find a way to teach them. But they feel that they could stand before the Rambam and say, listen, we know your psak, we know your conclusion, but your conclusion was based upon this information about the facts about women. But if you would add this information based upon your analysis of the Torah concepts, you would also come to the same conclusion as I am today. And that's what you really think. In other words, Shimshon Hirsch believed that given his facts, if he would have presented it before the Tanaim or Rime, they would be totally in agreement with him, even though they may have argued differently, given the facts that they had at their point in time.
And did he write it down?
He wrote who? Shimshon Hirsch? Yeah, he wrote a lot of stuff, where he presents his arguments and shows it. The fact is he really believed that this was the ideal of Torah, and this was the ideal of Torah eternally. It wasn't just the ideal of Torah in 1850 Germany, unless you want to say that given certain facts, this is the ideal of Torah. But the facts can change. But in terms of what the pure ideal is, the Orthodox thinker has to say this is the pure idea that's eternal. This is the pure idea, the ideal that's eternal. And that's something that's very, very different. You have to be able to argue that, based upon Torah analysis, that this idea is something that comes from Torah to you, from your analysis, and it would stand the test of time in terms of maintaining the logical consistency of it over time.
So it seemed that people didn't accept it because women weren't taught Gemara.
Well, now, I mean, basically, in terms of women learning Gemara, that's part of the issue. I mean, you go back to the start of women teaching women Torah. Okay, the start of the Beis Yaakov systems and so forth, right? So there were concepts that you can't teach women Torah. Okay, but there were big Dalim who said, yeah, you can't. Nowadays you have to teach women Torah. But the fact is you get into that, it's the ones who held you can't teach women Torah. They had certain viewpoints. The other people who said you can't teach women Torah, even though it's right there in the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, you can't. They have to say, listen, that's because these were the facts that they were dealing with. In terms of the eternal concept behind it, or the eternal law, right? Meaning those facts, those are those facts. But even these individuals, given the new facts today, would come up with the conclusion that you can do this. And you go back to the original theory, and then the arguments you have, the original theory is that this is an argument that you could make in front of anyone.
So that goes back to what I asked about, I think, the very first time.
Yeah.
About the environment having an influence on what we do and how
well, the environment has an influence. That's the difference. The environment has an influence in terms of the facts, but in terms of the theory, that's where it breaks down.
No, but whoever's giving Sakalacha has lived in a world surrounded by different
right,
factors
right,
than somebody 300 years ago.
Right.
I'm not disagreeing that wasn't right 300 years ago, and I'm not saying it's right. The environment plays a very big role.
That happens to be very true, but the difference is, what I'm trying to say is you're right about that, but the difference is as I try to develop it in terms of being an orthodox policy, I have to feel that my argument, the theory, could stand in any place. In other words, what happens is when we look at a situation, you look at facts and you look at law. Law meets facts, right? Okay? So the point is that in orthodoxy you try to have that the law is eternal and the facts is what change. So therefore, when you say you can teach women Gemara today, you can't. It would not be. It's not like, well, we can come up with some kind of argument to show that this is a legal theory that is acceptable within the language of the system, and therefore we can end up with this kind of this conclusion. And the reason no one came up with this legal theory before is because they didn't think this way, right? That's one way of looking at it in terms of actual legal theory. In terms of an orthodox perspective, what you have to say when you say this is sort of like, listen, the facts have changed. Okay, women are not the same social creatures as they were in the time of the Gemara in the 1200s and so forth. They're a different individual, a different being, right? The facts have changed. Raya, there's women who are scientists, there's women who can think, and so forth and so forth. Therefore, when the Gemara states that you can't teach women Gemara, or you can't teach women Torah because that they don't know how to think well, that must be based upon the perception of women of the time. Okay, they were responding to the facts, and therefore they came down to a conclusion that says that if the individual does not really think well or analyze well, then there may not be a point in teaching that person. Okay, but that's because of the facts. If the facts change, then obviously it's okay to do this. And the fact that I'm going to argue it's okay to do this, I'll argue it from the material itself in the theory, in the legal theory. And my argument, I would say that anyone in the eternal base medrash, I could present that argument to. Okay? In other words, it's an acceptable argument. They may not agree with this, but from the system itself. What happens in the historical school, in this more historical school, what happens that way is that an attempt to try and read things into Torah. It's an attempt to try and say, listen, we want to find a way of doing this using our traditional garb or traditional language. We want to figure out how to sort of put it into the system. And we understand that everyone did that in history. So therefore, what you're trying to do is you basically say, the theory constantly changed. The history changed the theory. And what people did is they basically tried to read into the Torah something in line with their moral perspectives of the time or their ideas of the time. And they said everyone thought the same way. In Orthodoxy, we did accept the fact that facts changed, but we always tried to maintain that the theory was consistently eternal. And our analysis tries to maintain that kind of perspective, and that really becomes the thing that really marks an Orthodox perspective, in the sense that it's like, and this is why I go back to this thing with Kabbalat Shabbat, the question is not whether there's a halachic way, in other words, hey, there's no halachic reason not to do this, so why don't we do this? The question is, what is the Torah really want me to do? And how do I understand what's going on over here? And how to understand the movement in time, if there is a movement in time, how do I be able to articulate it with a consistency of the Torah being eternal? That's a very different process. And that's really a lot of the issue now with a lot of things with women, for example. Is it the fact that are you really believe this is what God is telling you? Or is it the way, hey, I can get what I want and read it into the traditional way? So I'll give you another example. There was an example. The question asked whether a woman can read a ksuba at a chasna. So there was an individual, one of the gedolim, when he was asked that question, he said, yeah, well, a monkey can read the ksuba. That got into a lot of hot water. He got tremendously attacked for this. He was comparing women to monkey and so forth and so forth. What he's basically saying is there is no halachic status of reading the ksuba. Reading the ksuba is not a religious duty. The reason you read the ksuba at a chasna is to separate the kedusha, the ring part, from the nesuin, which is the final sheva brachas. The ksuba is absolutely has no aspect of a quote unquote a ritual, right? So the truth is you could read the ksuba, you could play a tape of the ksuba, you could have anyone read the ksuba. It's not a religious event.
You have a robot.
Okay? Yeah, you have a robot doing it, right? What's the question? The question is should you have a woman reading the ksuba? So the point is it's a bigger question. Should a woman be underneath the chuppah in that type of situation? Shouldn't women have this position in the situation? What is the Torah saying to me? Not that can I fit my idea? I want women in the ceremony. Can I fit it in? Or am I saying what I think is the ultimate ideal? Now the truth is, I saw someone say that in certain specific situations, this guy actually advocated for a woman, not the same gadol, but I saw another argument that in certain situations, the person advocated for a woman to read the ksuba because there were certain situations there it was really appropriate for that woman to read the ksuba. But the point is, it's a very different perspective. It's not, can I find a way to do what I want using halachic language? You see the same way with homosexuality in terms of the conservative movement. They're basically saying in the conservative movement, listen, of course, this has got to be accepted as an acceptable lifestyle, because the morality of our world is this being accepted as a lifestyle. Is there any way I can read it into the language of Jewish corpus, Jewish thing, Jewish verses, to try and come up with a way to say this is okay? Not what is it that God's trying to tell me. The perspective is that I'm supposed to try and find a way to sort of use this methodology in terms of working with something. So find it, and it's not the same as, let's say, finding it. Like, it's interesting because, like, take for example, you look in Shulchan Aruch, where there's a concept where it says B'tzarach Gadol, you can go to Kula, in a great need you can go to Kula, you can go leniency. But the fact is, law enforcement point out that's because you really believe that the lenient opinion is really the correct opinion. Just you're saying, okay, so generally we'll be machmer, but it's a great need, don't be machmer. But it's a very different process. Yes, it's true we deal with Torah. It's true we bring ourselves into Torah. But in the back of our minds, in terms of that policy, we want to hear what God's telling us. Now, we believe that we open up the door for what God's telling us, but we really want to hear what God's telling us. And in that idea of what God's telling us, the challenge is we want to be able to state that, and it should withstand the challenge of the eternal base medrash. That's in the back of my mind. The point is that in other policies, it becomes I'm trying to find a way to do what I want to do and trying to find some language to make it sound like it's halachic. But really, is that really what God's telling you to do? And that's what I was trying to point out with my daughter in terms of her attitude by Kabbalah Torah. Her question was, what does God want? What does the Torah want? What's the Torah stating to me? Not just what I'm reading into it, but not just the way I can play games with the Torah and find a halachic conclusion or a way of explaining it. What is it saying to me? That's the real issue. Yeah.
I have a few things. Bear with me.
Okay.
One is a notion, which I have a notion. Seems to be a typical bent of some conservatism, or as in not looking fondly on change,
Right.
among Jewish leaders throughout
Yes.
the history. So these people had this particular attitude, and it may have been borrowed from the wider world. I don't claim to know, but if they had that particular, I'll call it bias, we suggest it's not necessarily correct, but if they had that bias, I don't know whether that is a Torah.
Well, the fact is that inherently Torah is small c conservative, in a sense that because what exists now is given the force of what exists, and therefore what seems to be the voice of God. So if I want to say, hey, listen, I think that there's a certain switch to what God's saying, or so forth and so forth, then, and I have to be able to defend it within this world that has this base from the past, then the fact is there is a tendency towards a little bit more of a small c perspective.
I will tell you that bothers me. In a
Okay.
sense, it may not be quote unquote true. It may be what the majority, the structure it's decided.
The fact
It's
is,
not
okay,
necessarily
the
more
fact
than what
is,
it's
the fact is, and this is what I'm going to say, even though it's going to be on camera, don't quote me on this, but the fact is that the nature of Orthodoxy today, I think, has been pushed a little bit more to the small c conservative because of the advent of Reform and Conservative Judaism, in the sense that movement, greater movement, and so forth and so forth, there's been concern about the fact is that since there's these two movements which are creating movement which don't work within, aren't necessarily bound to the constructs of Orthodoxy, we look to them and say, gee, so we don't want to get too close to that. Like, for example, let's say in terms of there's certain arguments that maybe if there wasn't the conservative movement and the reform movement, there would have been more flexibility within Orthodoxy. But we're concerned about that. You see, there's an interesting aspect. Let's take studying the vernacular. Moshe Mendelssohn is always perceived to be incorrectly so, the founder of Reform Judaism. Chas v'shalom, Moshe Mendelssohn was a Gaon, was a Gadol, and was clearly Orthodox and a real Talmid Chacham and whatever. He really believed that Jews should know German, should know the vernacular. Jews should function within the greater world. Okay? He really believed that. So he promoted learning German, but the way I understand it, he promoted it as an idea where this is what I think God wants to do. Okay? The point is a lot of other people said, hey, we want to learn German because then we can enter into society, which will take us, it's not really because we think that God wants us to do. We like to learn German so we can hang out better with these people and enter into society and so forth and so forth. So a whole issue rose of giving sermons in the vernacular. Okay, and the Chasam Sofer, for example, was very much against it. Said, that you can't give sermons in the vernacular, you have to give sermons in Yiddish and so forth and so forth. Now, the question is, was he saying that like that's the way, Chas v'shalom, never you should give sermons in the vernacular, or was he saying in response to the times, in this particular circumstance, you can't give it in the vernacular, but in other circumstances maybe it would be proper to give it in the vernacular. The question exists is, what do you think God wants? So I think that someone like Moshe Mendelssohn really was thinking what they think God wants and was really analyzing it from a Torah perspective. But then people took over it and was not saying this is what God wants. They were saying, hey, this argument can let me get what I want. Okay, now that became much more, and then it became much more into the conservative, much more into the reform movement, I should say, and it became a methodology where we can make reforms and we can find language to sort of stip it in. Okay, not that we really are letting halacha tell us to do it. We're trying to find ways of stipping in and then moving beyond that. As long as we got to find some way of justifying within a system, we can find some way of doing that. So what occurred is what the Chasam Sofer did is that maybe even things that would become more acceptable, he became more concerned about those. Because once you start doing those things, it's not because people are pushing it, it's because people are driving it. Like, I'll give you an example in terms of women's movement. Rav Moshe was asked a question, I think it was concerning a woman wearing tzitzis. Can a woman wear tzitzis? Okay? And I don't think it deals with the question of Kli Gera. It wasn't a question of that. Can a woman wear a four-corner garment and put tzitzis on it? She's not mechuyev to do that. There's the tzitzis, she's not mechuyev in tzitzis because she do it as an eina mitzvah, someone not commanded. And Rav Moshe said it really depends on motivation. If she wants to do it because she believes that it's a Ratzon Hashem, I want to do a mitzvah, the same way as I want to take a lulav and esrog on Sukkos. It's another mitzvah. She's an mitzvah also. No reason why she shouldn't be able to do it. But if she's doing it because she says, I want to do what the men do, right, and I want to show that there's a way I can do it, then there's a problem. There's a problem. What's the motivation? And that's really the distinction. The fact is it something where you really are trying to figure out what you think the system is saying to you, or are you trying to fit it in? Now, what the system will be saying to you is a dynamic system. You're involved in thought. It will go through some transformations because of new ideas and so forth, because of the dynamic system. As Moshe Feinstein says, L'Hagdil Torah L'Dir, there's always new chidushim. But you're always believing that it's being said to you. And when you throw out the chiddush, you have a new way of learning the Gemara, you think there and believe that you can defend it against anyone eternally. It's not the new shtip from the 20th century or 21st century.
Do you think that some of the conservative guys couldn't stand up and say, I can defend and put forth in
they clearly have arguments.
Right.
But the fact is that I believe their motivation is much more.
Understand?
Okay. No, they clearly have arguments. Clearly have arguments. But the question is do you really think that's what the Torah is telling you, or is it that you are able to find a way for what you want through Torah language? This was an issue in the conservative movement with gays. Okay, basically, the Rabbi Dorff, who came up with the present conservative position on gays, which was basically says, we have to do this, and he sort of fitted into a certain understanding of the verses that he wants to understand it. It's not the fact that he would say, hey, listen, if I went into the base measures, I could show that, Rashi, that this is my argument, that's my argument. Saying, listen, I can find a way of reading the verses so I can understand it this way. And then, Rabbi Roth, Joel Roth, who was a professor of Talmud at JTS, is very upset by that. He said basically it's stepping outside the halachic system. The argument does not really hold water in a halachic argument, even from his perspective. So he was very upset with that. The question is whether you're trying to find a way of doing something, or whether you believe this is what's being told, and you believe that what's being told has validity into the future. Okay, that Sinai has validity into the future. One of the reasons you can have the historical school of Judaism is because basically they don't believe in Torah Sinai. They don't believe in the eternal voice of Sinai. They believe in the divine inspiration, things like that. But the fact is that what you're saying is God said something on Sinai, and we're always trying to figure out what did God say. And the fact, when I say a chiddush today, like Moshe came up with some remarkable chidushim in his life. But if you look at Moshe's chidushim, right, every one of them, right, is logically consistent, and you can sit there and say he could make that argument any time. Right? Maybe something happened that motivated him to try and work out this argument, but his argument can be presented in the eternal base medrash. And that really is what Orthodox policy is about. Yeah, there's a lot of movement, there's some movement, so on and so forth, but I can tell you right now, Rav Kook, he all the new things, I bet you, he really believes that he can give this argument to anyone, using the sources, and saying, this is the emes pshat of Torah. This is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said on Har Sinai. This is the emes pshat. That's what we're all working towards. There's an idea that there is an emes pshat. Now, there may be different people disagreeing about the emes pshat, but the fact is, you really believe it's the truth. You really believe it's what Sinai is about, and that's what makes it unique.